All right, well, if you have your Bibles, you can turn to Philippians 4. We're going to look at a couple famous passages today. You're going to be probably familiar with most of them, but we're going to end there. Again, if you don't know me, my name is Eric. I'm one of the pastors here. Pastor Brad will be with us next week. And we've been working through the series called Mind Battles. Today we're finishing it up. But it started with, we live in a world where there's a lot of hurt, right? And hurt people hurt others. And we see people, and maybe you are or have dealt with it, or you know people, coworkers, that are stressed and anxious, addicted, hurting with their self-image, don't understand their self-worth, right? We look around at students, right? And we see students that don't really understand their identity and who they are. We see adults that wrestle with, who we have become versus what our dreams were for our life, right? And how come those didn't materialize quite the way that we might have hoped or we might have thought. We see a lot of violence in the world, and it just happens almost randomly sometimes. I remember just if you remember, I was gone about a month ago. We went to Wisconsin like we do every year, and so my family, we flew into Chicago, spent some time in Wisconsin, eating lots of wonderful cheese curds, and then we flew out of Minneapolis, and as we were going into Minneapolis, it was going to be mid-afternoon, and Angie was driving, and so she was like, I'm hungry. Let's find somewhere to eat. I'm like, okay, what would you like to eat, right? And of course, she gave me the very woman answer, which is, I don't care. And so I'm like, okay, well, big food court. Now, I hate the Mall of America. We lived in Minneapolis for a long time. I do not like malls. My heart rate goes up when I'm in a mall. But for the sake of my wife, I was like, let's just eat at the Mall of America, right? And she's like, nah, I don't want that. So we just decided to go back to the airport hotel and then just get some food there. And so we did that. But then as we were there, I started to scroll on Facebook while we were waiting for the waiter. And, well, what had happened? A couple hours before that, about the time when Angie was like, where do you want to go eat? Somebody went to the Mall of America, got in an argument at a Nike store, and started shooting off a gun, right? And so they had shut down the store. Everyone had to leave the Mall of America, and it just kind of seems like it just happens all the time that there's a breaking point for so many people. And so we started talking about, a few weeks ago, how can we take care of our little corner of the world, right? How can we take care of our families and our churches so that hopefully people understand who they are and we're able to not find ourselves in those situations the best that we can. And so we looked at how, sometimes we think that, it's the byproduct of how we were raised, or it's the result of pain in our life. But as we've been talking, there's also a spiritual side of it as well, right? There's sin and there's spiritual forces at play, and oftentimes they play a larger part than we even realize. And so this battle is waged in our hearts and in our minds, and in those of whom we love, because if Satan can win the war in the mind, right, then everything else comes pretty easy. He's already won. And so we said he has two major strategies, right, to bring disorder into our lives and to distort our image. Again, God is a God of order. He created things in a certain order, and Satan loves to mess and bring disorder into your life and mine. It might be that something just goes wrong at work, right? And it just messes with us, and we don't. It might be that somebody had said something to you a while ago, maybe cut you down, or made you feel weak in a way that you never felt that way before. And so from that point on, your life just kind of felt like disorder, and like, am I doing the right thing? You start questioning yourself over and over. Maybe something happened and your finances all of a sudden went into disorder, and so it's affected you, and it's affected your mind and how you think and your worries and your anxieties. We also talked about distortion, right? We're made in the image of God, right? And so if he can mess with our image and how we feel about ourselves and how we think about ourselves, then he can get us on that as well. And so we talked about how oftentimes we don't need both in our life, right? He just needs to get us on one of those two hooks to feel like life is either in disorder or that our image is distorted. And we're going to become so preoccupied and so wrapped up in that that all of a sudden we don't really quite know what's going on. We don't understand who we really are. It starts to wreak havoc in our lives, right? And it feels kind of like we're just spinning. And so we can look at verses like, you're God's masterpiece, but that doesn't really do a lot of when you step back, your canvas just looks like fear and weakness and scars and regrets. And it doesn't look like this beautiful masterpiece that it says in Ephesians. And so over the last number of weeks, we looked at disorder and distortion and how that plays out in the context of fear and anger. We looked at how it plays out in being judgmental towards others and the attitude that we have towards others in our head. Last week, we talked about self-image and self-worth. Well, this week, we're finishing up with another major area. A lot of us experience weekly, if not daily. We're talking about the battles of stress and anxiety. And it could be trying to get everything accomplished on the schedule that you have. It can be worry over your child, right? Kids are back in school. Students are back in college now. It can be worried about like what's going on with them and how are they dealing maybe with that bully or that class? You know, how are they handling the workload? It can be different things like that. It can be finances. It can be work. We have all these stresses and anxieties. There's this woman that I know, and she's great, but she has so much stress in her life that when she comes in for her training sessions, because I do training and nutrition outside of here, sometimes I always start my sessions with, hey, how are you doing today? Because, again, that can affect their workout. If they're just torn down, I'm not going to make them do 100 burpees. I don't make people do burpees anyway. But for the most part, like, I want to gauge their workout or tailor their workout based on how they're feeling, because otherwise it can be counterproductive. And so I'll usually start with her, and I'm like, you know, how are you feeling today? And she's just like, I just want to cry. You know, and she's got so much going on. It's such a workload, and people have left her company to go to other competitors who can pay a little bit more or offer better things. And so she's got all of this, and she was just promoted to a new position, right? And she's got all of these stress going on, and she's got family stresses going on. And then she was like, okay, well, I know that meditation for me helps. And so she enrolled in these meditation classes to meditate and to become certified to teach others to meditate. But then they gave her homework to do outside of that. So she's got to meditate for so many hours outside of that. And then she started falling behind in that because she was traveling. And so the very thing that was supposed to become de-stressing to her life actually caused more stress in her life, right? And sometimes that can just how it feels. Like we just don't know how to get out from under the weight of all these stresses that are piling up. And so here's my goal today, and I've really got a couple goals. One of them, the smaller one, is to help us de-stress our life in certain ways, because I think we can de-stress our lives in certain ways. We just don't always do that, so we're going to look at that. But then more than anything, my primary goal today is to help you have peace in the stress of life. Right? Like some people, when we encounter stress, our brains get so overloaded and so much, I got to run here, and then I got to go there, and then I got to do this, and then I got to pick up that, and we start running in our minds, and we're stressed out and tired even before the day gets going. And wondering how we're going to get everything done, and then you get short with your family, and you get upset easily. You might neglect your physical health. You might turn to unhealthy addictions to relax. But then we have other people who they have a lot of stresses in life, and they just seem to breeze through it like they're on a sailboat. And you're like, how do you do that? Well, what I want for you today more than anything is to be able to have peace in the stresses of life. And here's why. All throughout the Bible, when you look at all of these, think of your favorite Bible characters from when you were a kid to now, right? We hear about all the great things that they did, right? Moses got in a burning bush. But when you think about it, and when you really step back and look at their lives, most of them dealt with enormous stress. Like Moses and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Ruth and Esther and Gideon, all the prophets, Saul, David, all the kings, right? The disciples, Paul, even Jesus had stress on their life. And sometimes we get so used to reading about what God did through them and the miracles that happened. We can read that Elijah called fire down from heaven. We're like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. But then we forget that he also asked God to take his life. because of the stress and the anxiety, and he was being chased and persecuted, and the queen wanted him dead. We can miss the persecution that the disciples went through. And so we can think that it's pretty cool that Peter was able to tell a guy to stand up and his ankles were strengthened and he was able to walk around jumping, but we miss the persecution that Peter underwent and how he ultimately died. Was killed, right? And so as we look at God's people, they were able to handle the stress and anxieties. There are times when they lost the battle for a while, but for the most part, they were able to make it through. And when we start losing the battle of stress in our minds, it starts to bring disorder, right? We start thinking, man, how am I going to get this all done? I've got this and that, and work and school, and I told my family we do this. And so we start trying to juggle more than we can handle. And then when the balls start to fall down, it brings distortion to our image, like, what's wrong with me? How come I'm not as good a parent as what's her name on Facebook? Or what's her name on the PTA? And we start wrestling with all these things. It starts to mess and distort our image. And we think, if I just did this, then I would be a better spouse. If I just did that, I'd be a better mom or a better dad or a better student. And so we're ultimately going to talk about how can we have peace in the midst of the stresses that are going on. But before we do that, we're going to look at the inventory of our lives. And we're going to start there because a couple years ago, I was at work, and this lady calls the club. And she hadn't been in the club to work out in years. And she said, I used to go work out all the time. I was great at it. I was on point with my nutrition. I even got protein powder and was making shakes. She's like, I knew exactly how to do everything. It was all laid out, but then life happened. I haven't been in a couple years, a number of years actually. And she's like, but here's the problem. I used to get the protein powder shipped to me monthly, but I haven't been in years, and so I don't know how to turn it off, and so I just accumulated every month these jugs of protein. And she's like, I've got years worth in my garage, and they keep coming, and I don't know what to do. And that's like some of us, though, right? We've gotten so used to life and the things that just keep coming and coming and coming, that there can be things that are stressing you out that are in your life that you don't need anymore, or maybe never needed, but yet we don't take the time to do the inventory and say, okay, so what do I need to shut off in my life? Where do I need to stop the busyness? Or where have I accepted the busyness and the responsibilities that I don't need to have in my life right now, right? Like, we need to learn how to say no, especially to those things that are causing us stress in our lives that don't need to be there. When I help people with training nutrition, sometimes one of the things that I'll do is we'll just sit down for an hour and we'll just start shutting off things in their life that are keeping them from their goals. Right? And so I've had a time where I've just went through, me and this lady, and she's a VP of something, we just went through her calendar and said, okay, so what are you doing that you need to delegate to other people? Because you're still taking work home with you and working all through the night. And we just went through and said, what can you give to this person and this person and this person, right? We just tried to shed that because for her, that was the big thing. And sometimes we have it where we just have those things in our life that we need to free ourselves from so that we can de-stress our life, right? That lady that called in, at any point, she could have actually just went onto her phone, onto the app, and clicked one button, and it would have stopped. It was that easy. But for years, she allowed something to come into her life every month, right, that was accumulating and costing her money and costing her a headache and then garage space. She was spending her time and money on something that she didn't need. And sometimes we don't get how easy it is to turn off a stressor by just saying no in an area of our lives. And so we have to take an inventory of our lives. Like, where do you need to say no? And no can be a very difficult word, especially for some, right? If your goal, if one of your strengths is to help and to please people, that can be a very good thing, but it can also make it very, very hard to say no. A lot of people don't like the word no, right? We like to make people happy. right? We feel like if we tell them no, that they'll think less of us. Or we think it might cost us a promotion at work. Yet no can be one of the most important words that we say, because no is what is kind of like the gate that allows us to bring things into our life or to keep things out. And so what do we need to say no to? Well, there's a story in Luke 10. A lot of you know this story. And it's about Jesus and Mary and Martha. It says this: "Now as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village. And a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching." Again, that's kind of groundbreaking in that culture for a woman to sit at the foot of a rabbi. But Martha was distracted with much serving, and she went up to him and said, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me." Notice in here that Martha assumes that she knows what Jesus wants for her. Right? She says, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me." Like, she doesn't even wait for an answer. How often do we do that with God? God, I need this. And we assume that he's going to go along with what we say, what we think. But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her." And so Jesus is like, "Martha, you're doing some really good things, but for Mary, right now, she's trimmed away those extra things by saying no. So Mary could focus on what she most needed at that time, which was to listen to the one whom she was in the presence of." Now, was it the custom for women to serve? Yes. Were all the other women serving? Yes, right? Everyone else might be doing it, but Mary recognized that for right then, she needed to say no so that she could say yes to something better. And then notice that Jesus doesn't even tell Martha that what she's doing is bad or wrong. Right? Like, what does he point out about Martha? He says, "Martha, you're anxious and you're troubled. You're stressed out about this stuff. You're focused on it. What might you and I be anxious and troubled about? What are our many things that we're troubled and anxious with?" I mean, maybe it's priorities. Right? Are you spending time on your priorities, or are you doing a lot of extra stuff? Things that someone else could actually do, or is it something that even actually needs to get done? And in reality, if it doesn't get done, life is going to turn out just fine anyways. Sometimes we can put false importances on things. Maybe your priorities have changed over time. And what used to be necessary or a focus for you no longer is or should be. When we first moved here a number of years ago, I started training. And back then I could work until 9 p.m., right? The kids were younger, so I could work until 9 p.m. I could go in, on Sunday if I wanted to for a few hours and train people. We do a lot of events at the club, and so I did do a lot of extra seminars or group training type stuff, and it was a lot of fun, and we had a lot of fun, and I worked on getting promoted and doing all this kind of stuff. But now, right, my kids are older, and they've got school events and sporting events, and I want to be there for them because this is an important time in their life. And so my priorities have changed, and so now I say no a lot more. I don't work as late, and very, 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 maybe 1 or 2 Sundays a year, I might go in on a Sunday there and train someone. It's a very special circumstance. I don't really do extra events anymore, and if somebody needs to come in for maybe a nutrition session and it's outside of my schedule, I'll just give them to somebody else, right? Because I'm not as worried about, I don't need to, before it was more about like money, right, and emotion. Well, now it's different, right? Now it's more about how can I spend more time with my kids? How can I spend more time with Angie? How can we have more family time, right? How can I put more time towards church, right? We do staff meetings on Monday mornings, so now I don't take anyone Monday mornings because we have staff meeting. That's a very important time for this church. But the same thing for church, right? Saturdays are my day off from here. Sometimes I'll go to a Saturday event, but for the most part, like if I'm usually working, because that's a busy day for me over at the club, but otherwise, I'm usually at one of my kids' events, so we have family time. Because that's a day that's set aside so that the priorities can be right. And so easy for us, though, to just fill up our calendar. It's easy just to plug in extra events, and if we're not careful, it starts to weigh on us of all these things that we have to do. And so I don't always like to say no to things, and I wish I could do more things, but I know where my priorities have to be, and so where do you need to say yes or no based off your priorities? Because if you don't say no, eventually you're probably going to hit a breaking point, and it's not going to look pretty. So it's priorities. Maybe it's relationships. Maybe it's someone in your life, friends, coworkers, extended family members, that when you're around them, they add stress to your life. You know anyone like that? You know, they stress you out, they drain you, right? Our closest relationships should give you energy in life. They should build you up. They should encourage you. You want people that will sometimes bring you down because they need to speak truth into your life and you need to be able to listen to them, right? We all need people like that. But for the most part, they should be people that are for you and not against you. So who brings unnecessary drama into your life? Who are the people that when you're around them, you feel like your energy is just drained? Or you become the person that you don't really want to be, right? Like who's kind of an energy vampire in your life that just kind of sucks the life right out of you? You know, sometimes we need to set boundaries and not, spend a ton of time with them. It's okay to click no on a friend request. You know, you can still be nice to people, but it means that sometimes that we need to take an inventory of who are our closest relationships. Who are we spending the most time with? In Proverbs, it says, a perverse person stirs up conflict. Who do you know in your life that's stirring up conflict? A gossip separates close friends, right? Who tends to gossip a lot around you, right? And you might even like it. You might even like those people because you want to hear the current gossip. But ultimately, it's divisive. And Paul writes a ton. He's got to deal a lot with that in the letters that he writes to churches. In Proverbs 18, it says, one who has unreliable friends soon comes to ruin. One who has unreliable friends soon comes to ruin, but there's a friend who sticks closer than a brother, right? So who are your relationships? Are they adding stress to your life, or are they bringing peace to your life? So priorities, relationships, those are two big ones. But even if we take an inventory of those, right, and adjust our priorities, make sure our relationships are good, even with all that, there's still a lot of stress in life. Because even after saying no, with everything that's left, we feel like we have to live perfectly. And so we feel like we have to be the perfect boss or the perfect employee, the perfect child, no matter how old you are, right? The perfect parent, the perfect spouse, the perfect friend. You know, we try to meet demand after demand and not let anyone down. Well, if you were here last week, we talked about the mirror, right? And we had the mirror here, and we talked about how when we look in the mirror, what I see is a reflection of who I think I am, right? And so you can see things in the mirror that externally aren't there, but inwardly are, right? And so that's why I will say, look at yourself in the mirror, right? It's an internal thing. And then we talked about how we had people on stage, right? And how we tend to take that mirror off the bathroom wall with us when we leave the house, and we tend to think that other people see how we see ourselves, faults and weaknesses and all of that. And that affects our image. And so we started talking about that, but we also said that when we look in the mirror, what we should see is a reflection of Christ. What we should see, when I look in the mirror, what I should see is a reflection of God working through me. right? Because ultimately, that's what he's doing. And you might have faults, you might have weaknesses, you might have things in your past, but when you look in the mirror, you should see somebody that the God of heaven and earth is working through right now. And he's reaching people right now, and that's a pretty cool thing. That's a pretty cool thing. That kind of changes how we view ourselves. And that has a huge play on stress levels, right? Because it takes the pressure off of what I feel I have to accomplish. And so from when I have to go to work, right, which is a stressor, to I get to go to work so that I can reflect God's grace and love to other people, right? That's a different attitude. It goes from being like, I feel like I have to be the perfect parent, and my kids have to be great at school or sports or listen well, be obedient, all that. It takes the pressure off you as a parent to go to, like, I get to be the one who God is working to bring his love into my family and to help us step out in faith where we need to. Right? It kind of takes the pressure off of you to have to accomplish everything, to just say, like, this is, like, God is working through you. And we just get to reflect that as we go through life. Right? And so it's not about title or income level, not about what you earn or all the marks you have to hit. It's do you get to reflect Christ in life and at work, at home, when you are cheering for your kids, when you are at school, when you do run to the store. And it's a mind shift in how we think about things, because we're so used to just saying, like, I don't measure up here or here, and right here I'm doing pretty good, but not down here. To how is God working through you in all the areas that you run to throughout the day? James says, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. He says, when you face trials of many kinds. And here he's talking a little bit more about persecution, but a trial is a trial. And how you're viewing it and how you're going through it at that time speaks a lot. I mean, sometimes the test you're going through isn't for you, it's for those watching you or your kids. Right? But ultimately, as we go through these trials, hopefully we can have the peace that the testing of our faith produces perseverance, and that then we may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. One of the greatest Bible heroes is Moses, right? And when I think of Moses, I mean, that guy had stress, right? Like, he committed murder for one, which that doesn't go away from you. But then he's also wanted because of it. He has to live with it. He's also had this stress about his culture, right? And the world that they were under and living in, and that they were being persecuted as slaves, and what's happening to his people wasn't right. And so he had that stress going on as well. And then God calls him and says, I want you to go do this. And Moses is like, I'm not cut out for that. And so there's that kind of workplace stress, but then he has to go to the most powerful man in the world at that time and kind of oppose him. And so that's got to be pretty stressful. And then he finally gets the Israelites out of Egypt. And then, which we would think at that point would be smooth sailing from there, but then things only get worse, because then they start complaining and grumbling and murmuring, right? And so I'm kind of amazed at Moses' patience, because some of you can't handle a complaining kid for 15 minutes, right? Moses is dealing 40 years with a grumbling, murmuring people that continually question God's faith and continually question Moses' leadership, and are prone to sin over and over and over again. And most of the time he was okay, right? There's an instance where he got a little bit angry for a while. But I'm more impressed with how he managed to hold it together for most of the time. But see, throughout his whole journey, Moses was able to handle it because he knew that God was working in him to accomplish good for his people, right? God had a plan for his people, and he was working through Moses to accomplish that and to see that all the way through. So God is at work in you for the good of your family. It might not always feel like it with all the stresses going on, but that's what is going on. And he's at work through you for your work as well, right? He wants more people to be reconciled to him. God is constantly at work through you. And that can give us peace. Because it's not all about us then and what we have to do and all the stresses, right? God is ultimately at work through us. And so many people in the Bible experienced stress and anxiety, and it was heavy, right? Again, some even said, God, I just want you to take my life. We've been looking at Paul in this series, and Paul and stress went hand in hand, right? Paul brought stress on people when he persecuted the early church. And then when he became a Christian, then he got persecuted. And so he was chased sometimes from city to city. And so he understood what it was meant to be beaten and falsely charged. And along the way, he's trying to keep the churches throughout the empire together and unified. And a lot of us, we might want the faith of Paul and to see the things that Paul got to see and experience those things. But I doubt a lot of us would want the stresses that Paul had to go through. We haven't experienced it a lot in our time here, since my family moved here, but I know a lot of you, if you grew up in church, you have probably experienced divisiveness in a church, right? How stressful is that time, right? That's usually one church. Paul is dealing with multiple churches that sometimes are close to being fractured. And so he's like, all right, so I got to write this letter to the Corinthians. So let's send that out. Oh, they didn't listen. I just send another one, right? And so he's having to deal with that, and Philippians is starting to get on the urge of it, right? You got two of the leaders that seem to be starting the fracturing. There's a little bit of divisiveness there. And so he sees that over and over in these different churches. He's trying to hold them all together. But then he says this in Philippians. When the Philippian church was being talked about and persecuted by those outside the faith, but then there was also some bickering going on within the church as well. And so it says this in Philippians 4, 6 through 7. This is kind of the key verse, and you've heard it before. It says, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your request to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. All right, Paul, the one who had all these stresses and was trying to do all these things, right? It's like how to minister to all these different churches. The church in Rome was growing. Even Caesar's guard was starting to turn to Christianity, right? How can Paul be so engaged in all this work and have all these stresses, but yet still find peace? And he tells you, he's like, don't be anxious about anything, but in every situation. He's in the middle of every situation. By prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God will transcend all understanding. Will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. He's like, pray and take it to the peace of God. You know what tends to bring down my stress level? Spending time with my kids and Angie. Right? Putting aside work or church or anything else and just holding my kids, watching a movie together, whatever it is, right? Spending time with those I love. Well, to find the ultimate peace, the same is true, except we need to spend time with God in his arms, right? Moses, stressful situations, still took time away to be with God. Paul took time away to be with God. Jesus was the ultimate example, right? He could have handled anything, yet he still found times that he withdrew from the busyness to spend time with God. When the early church started, it says they did 4 things. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayer, right? Prayer is our lifeline. Prayer connects us to the peace of God, because if God truly is trustworthy, then we can go to him with anything and trust him for anything, right? Every Sunday before church, the elders pray. Every Sunday after church, the prayer team prays. If you need prayer, they'll meet right back there after service today. You should go. Time in the Word, right? Prayer. If you want peace, you have to be connected to the one who gives peace that transcends all understanding in every situation. So whether it's fear or anxiety, anger, a tendency to be judgmental, stress, negative self-image or self-worth, right? How we handle the battles in our minds determine how we go through life. Determines what sets us off, determines what frustrates us so easily, determines what captures our hearts and our attention, determines our attitudes. And so oftentimes the words and actions that we do outwardly are just a reflection of what has first happened with the battle internally. Right? And so if we want strong churches and strong families, it starts with us being strong individually, but not physically as much as in our hearts and in our minds. Right? The mind is an important battleground. And as we win, we move forward. And every now and then, you might have a couple losses, but that's okay. You just get up, you keep moving forward because God is continuing to work in you in every situation. So you're going to accomplish what Christ has to do in you and through you as you take care of your little corner of the world. Because again, you and I are God's masterpiece, created us anew in Christ Jesus so we can do the good things he's planned for us long ago. Let's pray. God, as we're here this morning, we thank you that you created us in your image, that you created us to do good works, that you are working through us. We don't just get to observe, we get to be a part of that. But sometimes it's easy to feel like our lives are so disordered or that our image is so distorted that we feel like we're unuseful or that we have to rely on ourselves. And so today, we ask that you would help to remind us that it all comes back to you. And that I pray that we would have the peace, like Paul did, to be able to endure stress, that we would have the peace, your peace, which transcends all understanding, so that no matter what, in every situation, we might be able to move forward completely trusting in you. So give us eyes to see and give us wisdom.